Hey everyone, we're finally going to harmonize our first figured bass, which might be a bit misleading since there are no figures here, but that's because these are all root position chords, and while root position chords can be figured with the number 5, we can also omit the figures altogether to avoid clutter. Before watching the video, try to realize this yourself, but do not be fooled. This is not that easy of an exercise. These may just be root position chords, but there's a lot we can do with the voice leading here to add some nuance and sophistication to the realization. Let's jump in. The beginning is fairly straightforward. We have bass motion by a 4th/5th up until bar 3, and at bar 3 our bass moves by a 3rd. As I covered in my first video, when realizing root position chords where the bass moves by a 4th or 5th, we keep the common tone and move the remaining voices to their nearest chord tones. We follow this procedure up until measure 3, and when the bass moves by a 3rd, we keep the 2 common tones and move the remaining voice to the nearest chord tone. Notice I'm not re-attacking the common tones, they're being tied or held out. I recommend doing this and playing it this way because it creates some contrapuntal interaction between the lines as opposed to having everything occur at the 1-to-1 level. Now we have this 4th from A to D, but remember the exception. When confronted with a 4-2-5 progression over the 2-5, we prefer to move all upper voices in contrary motion against the bass to their nearest chord tones. If you want to know why this realization is preferable, refer to my video on exceptional resolutions with root position chords. Let's take a listen to this first phrase. So nothing too fancy, but it sounds like a phrase. Moving on, I'm gonna move pretty fast through the middle section here because I expect you guys to have a good grasp of the 3 rules for harmonizing root position chords that I covered in my first video. Basically, from bar 5 to the downbeat of bar 14, there are no exceptions. We just need to plug in one of the 3 rules to fit the bass movement and we'll run into no problems. If you apply the rules correctly, your realization should look something like this. You may have noticed the sequence for measures 10 to 12. This is the infamous Pachelbel sequence where the bass moves down a 4th, up a 2nd, down a 4th, up a 2nd, and so on. Lucky for us, this particular sequence doesn't require any fancy voice leading. Simply follow the regular rules and you'll get the right realization for it. Now here's where things get tricky. What would happen if we continued plugging in the rules like we have been doing up until now? We would end up with something like this. So what's the problem here? For one, this is already getting to be too low for the soprano. The soprano's standard range in strict harmonic study is from C4 to B flat 5. And in bar 16 it goes down to the B3, which is out of the soprano's range. On top of that, if we continue in this manner, we won't end the piece on a perfect authentic cadence. For now, all our exercises must end with a PAC, so if you find that your realization doesn't allow for an ending with a PAC, then you know that you have to change something somewhere to accommodate the PAC. So how can we solve this problem of register and line trajectory? The answer lies with the 6th chord. Oftentimes, deceptive cadences, especially those near the end of the piece, end with the 3rd in the soprano over the 6th chord as shown here. Knowing this, we need to realize the passage in such a way as to accommodate this cadence with the 3rd in the soprano. In order to do that, we double the G in the initial 6th chord, which in turn serves as a trampoline to change the disposition of our 4th chord and prepare the deceptive cadence. Don't be alarmed by the leaps in the inner voices going from 6 to 4. The movement from 6 to 4 often acts as a conduit for changing vertical disposition. Inner voice leaps in cases like this are not only extremely common but desirable. After the 4 chord, we need only follow the usual procedures needed to properly resolve the 5 chord to the 6 chord. Let's listen up until this deceptive cadence. Notice how organic our soprano line is. Always aim for this. So now that we're at home stretch, how can we finish this realization off with some class? First off, notice that the bass line repeats. The first iteration ends in a deceptive cadence and the second in a PAC. Knowing this, can we make the second iteration related to the first while also introducing something new, something different? An exact repetition would be fine, but let's see if we can create something more sophisticated. If we follow the usual rules, our soprano will look like this, and this is indeed the ideal soprano that we will be using. Notice how it sets up the PAC perfectly. Now, how should we go about realizing the inner voices? As I mentioned before, the 6 going to 4 acts as a conduit for changing vertical disposition. We have to go to this vertical disposition over the 4 chord here, because if we take the more parsimonious route with the 3rd right above the bass and the tenor, we'll run into some problems at the deceptive cadence and things will start to get too low again. Once we have the correct vertical disposition over this 4 chord, however, what would happen if we simply followed the usual rules? We would end up with something like this. Let's listen starting from measure 17 up until the deceptive cadence. There's nothing technically wrong with this, but we can do something much better. And here's where I think a lot of students fall short in their harmonic and contrapuntal studies. I certainly did. When confronted with exercises, I think too many students and teachers are content with simply finding a solution rather than finding the best solution. And I know, we could argue that there is no best solution or that it's subjective, but I think we have to at least strive to create a realization that's so convincing that people couldn't possibly imagine a better solution. Furthermore, there's a certain degree of trust we have to place on the person who made the exercise. Hopefully, we can safely assume that the exercise in question was made by a really good musician who crafted it in such a way as to teach the student some sort of lesson. This particular bass was given by Paul Vidal to Nadia Boulanger when she was in his harmony class. Yes, it's an exercise in realizing root position chords, but we have to trust that Vidal embedded something in this exercise for us, the students, to figure out. So what is that? Well, look at the soprano from measures 17 up until the end. Do you notice anything? Notice how stagnant the soprano is before each cadence. It's a pedal. The soprano is pedaling on G, our tonic, and what usually happens above or below a pedal? The remaining voices interact with each other. Because we don't have to really worry that much about the note held out as a pedal, the remaining voices are given more room to interact with each other. In this improved realization, we've also set the alto in motion together with the bass and the tenor. Up until now, the soprano has been acting as the main melodic force of the piece. Here, however, we give room for the lower 3 voices to shine. This creates a very satisfying oscillation between the bass and inner voices that kind of lulls the listener into what now seems to be the inevitable end of the piece. Notice the constant doubling of G, our tonic, over each 6 chord. By constantly doubling tonic, we reinforce the tonality and signal that things might be coming to a close soon, that we might be going home. But now we have one more iteration left to realize. How can we do something different but still related to the first? Why not have a double tonic pedal? Having the tenor stagnate on tonic together with the soprano here slows the momentum, which in turn begs for the inevitable closure of the piece. Let's listen to this whole thing and pay special attention to how the tonic pedals naturally lead you as a listener to the closing bars of the piece. There you have it. I hope you can start to get an idea of how beneficial this type of study can be. In this case, understanding the soprano's function as a pedal led to a more creative and sophisticated realization in the closing measures, but this type of thinking and execution kind of transcends style. The more you do exercises like this, the more you'll start to see within your own music what the material is implying, and how you could potentially exploit and manipulate said material in such a way as to create a sense of inevitability in everything you write. Thanks for watching. Next video we'll begin dealing with first inversion chords. Hit the subscribe button and follow me on Instagram at Back to the Basics if you're interested in more content. Thanks again and see you soon.